Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I wanted to bring a discussion point to you that we've used in running repairs online in Module 6, which is all about tendinopathy. And the discussion point is, what is the best loading option that we have available for tendinopathy? And here in particular we're talking about lower limb tendinopathy, which is more of my speciality. Now, if you look, there are lots of different options out there. We've got eccentric programs that are found to be effective in the literature, heavy slow resistance training, isometric only, combined approaches. We've got some programs that are daily or twice daily, others that are 3 times a week. There's lots of different options out there. So what we want to try and determine is what's the best option for our patients. So I'd really like to hear from you on this. As I say, it's a discussion point. So let us know in the comments, what loading programs do you find to be effective? How do you modify them to meet the needs of the patients that you're seeing? Are there any downsides to some of these popular loading programs that we see out there? How can we adapt them? Well, how can we get the best out of them? So let us know in the comments and replies to this video what you find most effective for lower limb tendinopathy in patients that you see in clinic. Now, I think with tendinopathy rehab, these loading programs can feel a little bit like a recipe. They're very structured, aren't they? You know, you look at things like your eccentric programs where you're doing, 3 sets of 15 reps, typically like twice a day of 2 different exercises over 12 weeks. They're very prescriptive and they're very recipe based. And we know when we're working with individuals that doesn't really work. That recipes don't really work particularly well. So in trying to answer this question of what's the best loading option we have for tendinopathy, I think the simple answer is the one that suits the patient in front of you. And I'm going to try and illustrate in this video through 3 different case studies how we can utilize our different loading options to pick the one that best suits the individual in front of you. So it's less about saying that it's eccentrics for everyone or heavy slow resistance training for everyone or a mixture for everyone, and more about thinking how can we modify these loading options to suit the individual. And again, I'd love to hear from you on this. How do you modify them? What works really well for you in clinic? So let's have a think about these 3 case studies that we have here. So first up, I'm going to talk to you about a patient that presented with very irritable proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And hopefully through these you can see that these different presentations require us to be flexible and not really just having this recipe that says, okay, this is tendinopathy, let's get out my tendinopathy sheet and work through that. So this is a patient with long-standing irritable symptoms, so irritable in fact that they've tried a number of different exercises from previous physios, and all it's tended to do is really flare up their symptoms and led to lots of frustration, lots of confusion about where to go. Now, clearly somebody who's got very irritable symptoms that have been stirred up by simple exercises isn't going to do very well with a heavy slow resistance training program as your first port of call. We've got to listen to these patients and find out what their experience has been in the past. And if even light exercises have been really painful, it's quite likely that loading them up really heavy and going straight down that route is going to be too provocative. So we need to work with this person with their irritable symptoms. The first step, we want to help them to understand their pain, help them to see that it's often actually, when it's long-standing pain, more about sensitivity of the tissues and not really about changes within the tendon or harm to the tendon at all. And that's an important thing to get in place really early on. And then we want to work together to see if we can establish what's manageable in terms of loading. And this might look very different from something like a heavy slow resistance training program. So for this patient with very irritable proximal hamstring tendinopathy, I might see if we can find just one exercise to start with that they can tolerate. And it might be at a level that we would consider to be subtherapeutic in terms of strength. Probably not enough to get them a lot stronger, but perhaps enough to be a starting point. So for this particular patient, our starting point was 2 leg bridges. So in a position they found comfortable, and we just started with 5 reps twice a day, and that was it. Now, it's highly unlikely these are going to get them really strong, but once we've established that that's manageable, then we can start layering in different exercises. And this concept of layering is quite useful for patients with high irritability. We can establish something that's manageable, And then we can layer in something else and see how they respond to it. And once we've established that that's manageable, we can look at layering in something else as well. So you can start to build a small collection of 2 or 3 manageable exercises that you can then start to progress up towards something a bit more therapeutic. So we start with some simple 2-leg bridges, 5 reps a couple of times a day, and we work with that for a week or 2 to establish that it's consistently manageable. And then we start to bring something else in. In this case, we use some prone hamstring curls, just working with flexing the knee against gravity, because resistance band work had been too provocative in the past. Again, about 5 reps in the morning and in the afternoon, looking at that being tolerable before bringing in another exercise. And then we brought in something a little bit more linked to function. They were finding it difficult to pick things up, so we brought in squatting in a shallow range, not going into deeper hip flexion, but just to get them used to those movements again. Small amount of reps morning and afternoon, and then bit by bit we're able to increase the number of reps, build up that tolerance, and then as that irritability settles, it's at that point it might be appropriate for us to say, okay, now we're ready to slot you into something that perhaps is going to work on some of these strength deficits. And this patient did have strength deficits, particularly in the hamstring of that painful side. So now perhaps we can start to load these up a little bit more and bit by bit build you towards where you want to be. So with this particular patient and with a number of patients, we often use a traffic light system. Now, I know a lot of you be familiar with this idea of using a traffic light to guide pain, but I think we can take it a step further and really individualize it. So this is a sort of traffic light system we might use with someone. So this is about guiding progression. So if we start right at the bottom in the green kind of category, the green light of go for progress, this is saying to the patient that you can progress your activity, you can progress your rehab exercises when you feel ready to, when symptoms are mild and you've got relatively low fatigue levels. So we're trying to place them in control and saying, okay, at this point, this is a good point to try and push on a bit more. If we go up into the next category, the kind of amber category, this is what I would call more about holding, consolidating where you're at. So if they're starting to get more moderate or severe symptoms, or they're more fatigued, or the symptoms are just starting to linger a little bit longer towards that sort of 24-hour point, we might say, okay, let's hold where you are. Let's consolidate what you're doing at the minute. And there can be real value in that, saying, let's stay at this level for a couple of weeks. Let you get used to this before we push on again. And then if we go up into the red category at the top, this is where symptoms perhaps have got a bit more severe. They're in flare-up. Their symptoms are lasting after activity. Perhaps they're starting to affect things like sleep and other everyday activities a bit more. Or maybe they're very fatigued, they're very stressed. There's lots of other things going on in their life. At this point, it's more about slowing things down, focusing on recovery for a bit. So reducing the provocative activity, so particularly the ones that really stir things up, but keeping other activities going and just reducing them to a manageable level, not stopping altogether, and using calming strategies that settle things down. So if there are particular exercises that help, or other activities like relaxation, mindfulness, distraction, etc., now is a really good time to bring these in. Now, I try wherever possible with people to get them to create their own traffic light. We give them this framework and we say, okay, well, I'd like to go away and have a little bit of a think about it. Flesh this traffic light out a little bit. What are the signs for you that you need to kind of hold and consolidate a little bit and give it a couple of weeks at the level you've achieved before progressing again? What are the signs that things are good to go and you can push on a bit? And when are you starting to see that actually you've overdone it a little bit and now might be time just to cut back a little bit to focus on recovery? So you're kind of giving them the control and helping them really understand how they can modify their activity. So hopefully you can see, coming back to that question, what's the best loading option? It is got to be about the individual, and in this irritable case, it might well just be about finding what's manageable for that person. And the great thing about the research in tendinopathy is lots of different approaches have been found to be successful. There's no one right way to do it. So clinically, I would work with freedom with these patients and make it more about them and finding what's tolerable for them at that start point, what their goals are, and gradually progressing on from there. So that's case study 1. Case study 2 is a patient with gluteal tendinopathy. Now, this patient had some what we might call intrinsic factors that were influencing tendon health. So she had altered thyroid function, she was also perimenopausal, and I think that was influencing how well she could tolerate exercises, particularly dynamic exercises. So when we tried to progress her on to more dynamic strength work, it just really flared up her tendinopathy. So actually in her case, when we're looking for what's the best loading option, what suits the individual, she found that isometric exercises were the most effective. They were the best tolerated. And there is actually now evidence to show that progressive isometric exercises, if we're progressing them by increasing load, can actually be a good option for tendinopathy. It doesn't always have to be about dynamic rehab. So in her case, the best option for her was a progressive isometric only program that sort of took into account the intrinsic factors that were influencing her tendon health, and she was able to gradually progress the load and build on and do really pretty well with that. So again, we've got to try and work towards what works for the individual and not get too bogged down into these specific recipes. Now, final case study on this is a runner with Achilles tendinopathy. Now, this is a runner who's the other end of the spectrum, low irritability. But listening to them, they're telling me that the thing that they find most provocative is the faster running for their Achilles tendinopathy. So if they're trying to do tempo runs, interval sessions, sprinting, that's what really stirs the tendon up. And actually, with the Achilles, we know when we run faster, there's more stress on the tendon. But also, it's at that point that we need to be able to produce power. We need force at speed. Now, this is a person who may well benefit quite well from a combined approach. So perhaps doing your more traditional heavy, slow resistance training stuff, which is essentially progressively loading the tendon to try and build up strength through the calf muscles and in the Achilles, and develop that tolerance of running. And we know strength is important for power, so it's a good idea to do this first and really strengthen up that calf. So this would be someone we might get them in the gym 3 sessions a week, lifting fairly heavy, 12 rep max onto 10 rep max, 8 rep max and above. But to address the issues with power, at some point, we need to expose them to faster running. So we need to plan a graded return to intensity in their running. And we also need to include exercises that address the power deficits. And the best thing we can do for that is quite often plyometrics. So this would be an example of a combined program, heavy slow resistance training that progresses in combination with plyometric exercises that also progress. So we might start with double leg work, like squat jumps or forward jumps with both legs, going on to things like bounding and then onto hopping, and trying to really increase the length of the hop, emphasizing really short ground contact times to get that rapid, powerful contraction, but bringing them in gradually because they're quite provocative potentially for tendon pain, making sure we've built up that strength and load tolerance first. So 3 examples there, hopefully illustrating that the key thing to take from this video is to answer the question, what's the best loading option in tendinopathy? It's really got to be down to what's the best loading option for that individual. Being prepared to be flexible, look at all the different options we have and find out which one is going to work best with that individual in front of you, and be prepared to adapt them. Don't feel trapped into the specific reps, sets, loads, etc. that are being used in the research. That shouldn't trap us to only be able to use that approach. Working with individuals requires a little bit more flexibility to get the best results out of it. And particularly in those irritable cases, it's going to take time to get there. It's okay to give it that time and set those expectations early on, because you can see a great deal of progress when we take a bit of time and we just work over things gradually. And that lady who started with very irritable symptoms that we talked about that first case study is now back into doing some running and progressing really nicely back into doing activities she loves for the first time in several years. So while we started small with a really low level, we've actually been able to build up and get her back into a return to running program and get her to doing stuff that's probably going to be more effective in building strength and load tolerance long term. Okay, thank you very much everyone for listening. I've put a link to our webinar series in the title there. So we've got free webinars there on Achilles tendinopathy and lateral hip pain, which goes into a lot of detail about gluteal tendinopathy if you'd like to learn more about tendon pain. As I said, this is a discussion point from Running Repairs Online, so I'd really love to hear from you. What do you find works in tendinopathy? How do you adapt things? What loading protocols and things do you use, and how do you make them suit the individuals? Let us know in the comments. As ever, we'll look out for your questions and things. And thanks very much, everyone, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Okay, then. Bye for now.